Tonight's session is a little different. Instead of a single mystery, we're stepping into 3 true stories, each one stranger than the last. Real missing person cases that began like ordinary disappearances and ended in ways no one could explain. You'll travel from the quiet streets of Mexico City to the rural fields of Brazil to a small, guarded compound where silence itself became the final witness. These are the true stories behind what people leave behind when they vanish. Good evening, and welcome to Midnight Horror Society. Here we take the strange and the chilling and tell them slowly, like whispers meant for the night. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe only if you feel at home here. In the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting to see how many of us are awake together in the dark. So dim the lights. Let the sound of the night, rain, crickets, or just the quiet of your room settle around you. Get comfortable. And when you're ready, let's step into tonight's story. The guards wouldn't meet his eyes. When Carlos Herrera Sr. stepped into the visitation hall that October afternoon, the place felt too warm for a building made of concrete. Fluorescence hummed. A fan wobbled on its mount, pushing air that smelled like bleach and old pipes. Chairs scraped. People talked in low voices, the way you do in hospitals and courtrooms, trying not to disturb whatever decisions get made in rooms like this. At a table near the end sat a man in khaki inmate clothes, elbows bandaged in dingy gauze, one eye the color of rotten plums. He kept his hands folded under the edge of the table like he was afraid to show them. When he finally looked up and saw Carlos, something caved in behind his expression, like a shelf giving out under a hidden weight. They didn't shake hands. They said their names softly, almost like apologies. For a few seconds, neither of them added anything. The hum of the lights pressed down on the space between them. "You know why I'm here?" Carlos said. The inmate nodded. "Your son, Juan." For almost a month, the prison had been on its own clock. Tocaron, officially the Aragua Penitentiary Center, had slipped out of the hands of the state and into the grip of men who already ruled the corridors long before the gates were locked. Inside those long, low buildings where cinder-block walls trapped the heat and made it hum, the guards had retreated to the perimeter and the gangs had taken the middle. Everyone in Venezuela knew it. The nightly news made it plain. Plumes of smoke rose like flags over the compound. Helicopters circled. The government issued phrases like dialogue and stabilization. The name that traveled fastest through the rumor channels was old and ugly: Dorangel Vargas, El Comediante, a man already infamous long before Tocaron. People knew the stories from earlier years. Even those who didn't believe them remembered the nickname and the way it stuck to him like a smell you couldn't wash away. Inside the prison, the name meant a different thing. A center of gravity. A man who could decide what happened next. Juan Herrera Jr. had been there a year, serving time for robbery. 23, quick on his feet, the sort of kid who apologized in one breath and argued in the next. He'd written letters home at first. "I'm good, Papa. It's hot. Food is bad. I'm staying clear of trouble." Then, as the tension grew, the letters got shorter. Then they stopped. The riot sealed everything off. For days, the only updates came from people who had people inside. Wives, cousins, mothers. A guy who claimed his brother's friend had stood on a laundry roof and watched a beating in the yard. The government said the situation was under control. The families heard gunshots in the background of smuggled calls. When the military finally pushed in, when the gates yawned and the uniforms moved back through the middle and the smoke thinned, the list started. Injured, dead, transferred. present for muster. The lists were incomplete, which is another way of saying they were useless. They did not hold Juan's name. Carlos did what fathers do when the official lines go dead. He showed up in person. He stood at the outer fence, sweating through his shirt in the dry heat, holding a plastic folder with his son's photo and the little proof of life details only a family carries. A vaccination card, a school certificate, a copy of a letter that begins Papa and ends with an uneven heart, as if the pen had quivered there. He spoke to anyone who would stop. Guards coming off shift, a clerk with a clipboard, a man in a plain shirt who might have been a supervisor. He learned the posture of people who don't want to answer. He learned to hate the phrase, "Estamos verificando." We're verifying, because it meant exactly nothing. The name of a survivor reached him through another prisoner's wife. He knows, she told him. Low and tight, like the words were contraband. He saw something. He'll talk. She didn't say why. Maybe the man had lost someone too. Maybe he was too hurt to be afraid yet. Maybe he was hoping that if he told this one father what he knew, God would take notice and do something about the balance of things. That's how Carlos ended up at the plastic table, staring at the bandages and the bruises and a man who could not meet his eyes. At first, the man said nothing about Juan. He spoke about Vargas, how when the first alarm sounded and the sound of boots receded toward the gates, he and his people came forward like a tide that had been waiting for the pull. He spoke quietly, as if the name itself could cut him if he mishandled it. The guards stopped giving orders, the inmate said. We started getting them from him. He said Vargas moved like a man accustomed to being watched, not nervously, but with the ease of somebody who believes the watching is part of the point. Men followed him with machetes, scavenged from the maintenance sheds and rifles that had been in the prison before anyone would admit it. People you didn't see often became visible, and people you saw every day slipped into the shadows. The order of things reversed. The first week, the electricity flickered and died in pieces. The kitchen kept hours, only men with knives respected. The taps coughed rust and quit. Barrels appeared like magic, filled from a hose spliced into a line no one claimed to know existed. Where there had been rules, there were now favors. Where there had been routines, there were queues, whose lengths were decided by the size of the men standing near them. Everyone was hungry, the man said. Not the kind that makes you angry. The kind that makes your head buzz. Small economies sprang up. A half bar of soap for a tin of sardines, a pack of cigarettes for 2 cups of rice. Some men traded the shirts off their backs for a bowl of something thin and salty. Others hoarded and were beaten for it. No one slept. The lights didn't allow it, and the fear wouldn't either. It took Carlos a second to realize the man was holding his breath between sentences, as if he were diving for them. He made himself wait. He did not push for Juan's name. He ran the food, the man finally said. And the way he said, he could have meant Vargas, could have meant the idea of hunger made into a person. He said nobody under him would starve. Carlos felt the smallest thaw of relief. If there was food, there was a system. If there was a system, there was a way to bargain a son through it. My boy, he said carefully. Did you see him? The man nodded once. Your boy helped, the man said. Carrying sacks, taking lists, doing what they told him. The relief stalled. Doing what they told him is not the same as safe. It's a phrase that can mean survival. It can also mean you have been noticed by the wrong person. Outside the visitation hall window, the late afternoon slid along the compound wall like a bright knife. Somewhere in the administrative building, a copier coughed and fell silent. In that ordinary sound, Carlos felt the rough edge of fury. How could there be photocopies and coffee cups and men stamping forms, while a father sat here trying to learn whether his son's name belonged on a list at all? He gripped the table. "Tell me what you saw," he said. "Please." The inmate stared at his bandaged hands. When he finally spoke, it came out like a confession. "I saw the lines. I saw the pot. And later I saw a shoe by the ash." Carlos's mouth went dry. "A shoe?" The man's one good eye filled. "Size like a boy's." He took a shaky breath and continued. Vargas had begun to hold gatherings in the gymnasium. Men stood on the bleachers, knees against the metal slats, while orders were read. People who asked questions were corrected in front of others, not enough to kill them, just enough to show how easily it could be done. Vargas spoke about loyalty and survival, the way a commander does when he wants the words to feel like food. The rumors ran in circles. Supplies were coming, they'd cut a deal, a truck got through. The kitchen fires burned hotter one evening, and smoke curled from the vents with a different smell, unfamiliar, fatty, like the scent of cooked meat that doesn't match any memory you trust. The lines formed without anyone having to be told. Bowls filled, spoons scraped. Some men ate quickly. Some ate with their heads turned, the way you do when you're trying not to look directly at something. Some whispered to each other without moving their lips, sharing the kind of rumor no one should have to consider. The inmate swallowed. His voice thinned. "They told us it was different cuts from animals, that the outside sent it, that we were lucky." He looked like he might be sick. I wanted to believe that. Carlos's fingers ached. He only then realized he'd been squeezing his hands together under the table. He forced them open. Like so many men his age, he had learned that you can sometimes control your voice if you can control your hands. "When did you see my son last?" he asked. The inmate closed his eyes for a moment, and for that moment Carlos wanted to shout at him not to do that, not to put a dark pane over the one clear window he had left. But the man opened them again. "He was carrying a crate," he said. "He looked tired, but he was walking. He had a list in his hand. He told someone he'd be back. Back where?" The man shrugged helplessly, a child's gesture in a broken body. "I don't know," he said. "It was loud. Everyone was moving. I thought I would see him again." He pressed his palms flat on the tabletop as if he were bracing himself against something that might still be coming. "They said the hunger was over," he whispered. "They said nobody would go to sleep hungry again. They told us not to ask," he said. "They said there had been a delivery in the night. They said whoever was complaining could wait outside the line and watch other men eat." He glanced at Carlos and then away again. "A man made a joke about the taste," he said softly. "Another man told him to shut his mouth if he wanted to keep it." Carlos's throat burned. He felt the familiar desire to grab the edge of the world and pull it straight. And he knew the world does not move like that for any father. He asked the only question left. "My son," he said. "Where is he?" The inmate stared at the floor. "The last time I saw him," he said, "he was walking toward the kitchen with a list in his hand." He swallowed. "I didn't see him come back." He told Carlos what other men had told him, and how testimony in a place like Tocoron slides like oil across the surface of things, refusing to mix with anything that might hold it to account. He told him about a rumor that someone had seen Vargas in the kitchen doorway, not eating, only watching. He told him about a shoe by the ash He told him that later, when the military came, some men refused to eat anything at all, not because there was nothing, there was something, suddenly, but because the smell of it pulled a thread inside them that would not stop pulling once it began. He did not say he saw Juan's body. He did not say he saw Vargas order anything. He did not say he saw the thing everyone had begun to say. But it was in the room between them, a third presence, patient and immovable. "People will tell you there is no proof," the inmate said at last. "They are right about that. Proof disappears here. It goes where the light doesn't. But those of us who were there, we know what hunger does, and we know what it did to us." Carlos pressed his palm flat on the bulletin board beside him to keep from falling. Paper crackled under his hand. Notices about schedules, a list of contraband items, a faded reminder to keep the corridors clear. He stared at the ink until it blurred. He asked the last question because he had to. "What did they do?" he said. The inmate shut his eyes once and opened them. His voice was so quiet, Carlos leaned in to hear it. "They fed the prison," he said. The words turned to metal inside Carlos's chest. He didn't remember walking back through the gate, didn't remember the sun, didn't remember the trip across the gravel lot. He remembered the feel of his car key, missing the slot twice before it found it. He remembered the way the steering wheel looked too close to his hands, like a photograph taken with the wrong lens. At home, he took the folder out again. The proof of life documents. The letter with the uneven heart. He set them on the kitchen table. He stared at them so long the light changed twice and the shadows moved across them like silent mouths. He did what fathers do when the world refuses to make space for their grief. He made noise. He stood in front of cameras outside a government building and said his son's name. He described the things he had been told and the things no one would confirm. He used the word cannibalism once and watched the reporters flinch in the same way as the guards in the visitation hall. A reflex of the body when it wants to believe the ears misheard. Officials repeated the phrase. There is no evidence. The phrase is a wall if you want it to be. It is also a door, but you have to have the key. And the key is always kept in a drawer labeled internal. Vargas remained incarcerated. The prison continued. The stories settled into sediment the way they do when too much water has moved over them. And then they were part of the ground everyone walked on without looking down. The story never ended. It only spread out and lay down like a fog and made the edges of things strange. There are places you can visit in Venezuela where the wind smells like sugarcane and diesel and rain. There are places where it smells like the sea and rusted bolts and the sourness of fish scales. Near Tocaron, at certain times of day, it smells like dust and hot metal and the faint, humid tang of kitchens that have nothing left to cook. If you stand there long enough, you might begin to understand how a man could live years inside a question, and how a government can survive by refusing to answer it. No one has been charged in connection with Juan Herrera Jr.'s disappearance. Dorangel Vargas remains in custody. The phrase, no evidence, is still available for anyone who needs it. When people ask what Carlos believes, he doesn't make speeches. He tells them what he heard in a room where the lights hummed, and a man's hands shook and guards kept their eyes on nothing. He says his son carried a list toward a kitchen and did not come back. He says there was a shoe in ash, and bowls of something thick, and a line that moved again like men had been promised it would. He says a broken voice told him 4 words that won't leave the room no matter how many times officials close the door. They fed the prison. He doesn't know if repeating that makes the weight lighter or heavier. He only knows silence feels worse. Have you ever heard a truth so unbearable that denial felt safer than belief? Tell me what you think below. Tonight's story isn't fiction. It comes from the dry heart of rural Brazil in the early 1960s, a place where nights were long and silence could stretch thin enough for strange things to slip through. What you're about to hear is a real missing person case recorded in official Brazilian Air Force archives under envelope 05. It has been told the same way for more than 60 years, by the man who watched his father vanish into something he couldn't explain. The first thing Raimundo remembered was how quiet it became after his father vanished. One moment, the air outside their small house was alive, hissing, whispering, turning in on itself like breath caught in glass. And the next, it folded into silence so complete that even the insects stopped. He stood in the doorway, barefoot on packed earth, his lungs refusing to move. The yellow smoke hung there for a heartbeat longer, dense and swirling, like it had been poured instead of blown. He could see it shifting, thick coils rising and falling around the rough frame of the door. And within that smoke, faint shapes spun, metallic, cylinder-like, glowing softly as they turned in perfect rhythm. His father, Rivellino, had stepped toward them with the steady gait of a man who'd already decided not to turn back. He had one hand raised, the dull gleam of a knife catching the light. Then the smoke swallowed him whole. "Pai!" Raimundo shouted. The sound came out thinner than it should have, swallowed by the heavy air. He ran forward, every part of him focused on grabbing that sleeve, that arm, anything. When he plunged through the yellow veil, it was like falling into another version of silence. The smoke didn't drift or scatter. It simply vanished. The cylinders were gone, and his father wasn't there. 6 decades earlier, in a forgotten corner of Brazil called Duas Pontes, the Mafra da Silva family lived in a shack with only 2 rooms. The walls were mud and thatch. The roof leaked when it rained. The air inside always smelled faintly of smoke and damp clay. There was no electricity, no radio, no telephone. When night came, their world shrank to whatever the fire could reach. Rivellino Mafra da Silva was a quiet man who worked odd jobs: wood gathering, hauling clay, trading what little he could for salt or sugar. He had 3 sons. The oldest, Raimundo, was 12 that summer of 1962. The younger 2 still slept in a pile of straw and dreams. Their lives followed the rhythm of the land, up before sunrise to bed after the fire burned low. When the day's work ended, they sat shoulder to shoulder by the hearth, letting the night hum around them. That August evening began like all the others: the soft pop of kindling, the whisper of wind outside, the unspoken comfort of being together when the dark pressed close. No one could have known that in just a few hours, the world beyond those walls would start speaking their names. It began with a sound that didn't belong. From the kitchen came a scrape, quick, close to the ground, not quite animal and not quite human. It was the sort of noise that catches in your chest before your mind can name it. Raimundo turned toward the door. The firelight stretched his father's shadow across the floor. Something moved. A dark figure, low and fast, crossed the kitchen floor and slipped into the far corner where the light couldn't reach. He only saw it for an instant, but it was enough to make the small hairs on his arms rise. He looked to his father and saw the same frozen stare. Before Raimundo could speak, Rivellino was already moving. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, slammed the kitchen door shut, and dropped the latch. The sound jolted the younger boys awake. "What was that?" Raimundo whispered. Rivellino didn't answer. He stood still, one hand pressed flat to the door, listening. The fire crackled softly behind him. His face was tight, unreadable. Finally, he turned back toward his sons. "It's all right," he said, voice low and steady. "We're safe in here." He said it like a man trying to convince the night. For a time, nothing moved except the flames. The younger boys drifted back toward sleep, and Raimundo tried to convince himself it had been an illusion. Smoke and shadow, nothing more. Then came the voices. At first, they were faint, murmurs blending with the wind, but the words grew clearer, sharper, threading through the cracks in the walls. They were calling a name. His father's name. Rivellino. The voices multiplied. 3, maybe 4, rough, laughing voices without warmth. "If he comes out," one said, "we'll kill him." Every child in the room turned to their father. Rivellino stayed perfectly still, head tilted toward the sound. The firelight danced across his knuckles as his hand tightened around the latch. "It's a cruel joke," he said finally. "Someone from the town." "We stay here till morning," so they waited. The voices lingered for a while, then faded into the dark. Outside, something brushed against the wall, once, twice, as though testing it. Then nothing. The fire burned low. The youngest boy began to snore softly. Raimundo stared at the door and counted the seconds until the first hint of dawn. When light finally crept through the cracks in the walls, it felt like waking from a nightmare without being sure the dream had ended. Rivellino stood, straightened his shirt, and told his sons to stay where they were. He unlatched the kitchen door slowly. No sound, no movement, just the soft gray air of early morning. He turned back. "It's fine," he said. "Don't move." He crossed into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. Raimundo held his breath. He heard normal sounds at first. Footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the faint clink of metal. Then, after a long pause, his father returned. In his hand was a knife. "I'm going outside," he said quietly, "to make sure." The boys didn't answer. They just watched. Rivellino managed a brief smile. Not reassurance exactly, but acknowledgement. Then he stepped through the kitchen again, opened the outer door, and disappeared into the pale light. The air shifted in the room, cool for a moment, then still. That was the last sound they heard from him. Raimundo waited until he couldn't anymore. He told himself he would just peek, make sure his father was standing in the yard, knife in hand, ready to say everything was all right. He opened the kitchen door. The outer door stood wide open. Beyond it, the yard was filled with yellow haze, swirling like smoke but moving with purpose. It rolled and folded, holding its shape as though commanded by something unseen. Inside that haze floated several dark shapes, cylinders, metallic and turning. Each rotation gave off more of the yellow mist until the doorway itself looked alive. And in the center of it, Rivellino stepped forward. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked into the heart of it. "Pie!" Raimundo yelled and ran after him. He hit the threshold and the smoke vanished. No glow, no movement, no sound. Only the pale morning light and the empty yard. He called out again and again, circling the small house, searching the ground for footprints, broken grass, anything. There was nothing. It was as though the world had shut its mouth around a single name. Neighbors came when the boys called for help. Soon men from the nearest town arrived, followed by local authorities. They searched for days. The surrounding scrubland was combed inch by inch. A mile away stood a great boulder, split by a narrow crevice. They checked there too, lowering lamps into the dark, calling Rivellino's name into the hollow. Nothing. Weeks turned to months. The case grew cold. Then, on March 10th, 1963, 6 months after that morning, a group of hunters passed near the same boulder. One of them noticed a faint smell rising from the crevice. earthy, metallic, wrong. He looked closer and saw pale bone in the shadows. Authorities came again. They found what was left. The skeleton was identified as Rivelino Mafra da Silva. No cause of death could be confirmed. No one could explain how his body ended up where the search had already passed. In official language, it became an unresolved disappearance. But the Brazilian Air Force later filed it under envelope 05, Duas Pontes Incident. The report was brief. Unidentified aerial phenomena observed prior to disappearance. Witness: minor male Raimundo never changed his account. Not once. He said a shape crossed their kitchen. He said voices called his father's name. He said his father walked into a yellow cloud filled with spinning cylinders. And when he followed, everything was gone. Decades passed, but he told it the same way. No embellishment, no edits. He never claimed to know what it was, only that it happened. Some called it a crime disguised by superstition. Some called it proof of something not of this earth. And others said it was the mind's way of making sense of grief. A boy's imagination freezing the moment before he could admit his father was gone. But in Duas Pontes, people still whisper about that night. They say the wind carries a faint hum across the fields, low, rhythmic, almost mechanical. The shack still stands, its 2 rooms long since emptied. The walls creak when the heat shifts, like an old house remembering. Raimundo never went back. When asked what he believes, he only says, "I saw what I saw, and I ran when I shouldn't have." Then he looks toward the horizon, where dawn always begins with a thin streak of yellow light. Have you ever seen something so strange you kept the details small, just so people would believe you? Tonight's story isn't fiction. It comes from the shadows between memory and fact, places where silence can hide what we're not meant to see. The sound came first. Something heavy striking plaster, followed by a contractor's voice cutting through the afternoon like an alarm. "Vengan! Come here!" In the hall, Luis Garcia looked up from a box of old clothes. His brother, Esteban, dropped a stack of photo frames. They exchanged a glance, half confusion, half the reflex of men who've already lived through too many surprises from this house, and ran toward the bedroom. Dust hung thick in the air, white as chalk. A man in a hard hat stood frozen beside a hole in the wall, his hammer still raised. For a long moment, nobody said what they'd seen inside the gap. Then the contractor's face changed. "Senores," he whispered, voice shaking. "There's something here." The house had been empty for years. Once it was a home filled with ordinary noise, radio music, a mother's voice, 2 boys laughing over the sound of a kitchen fan. Now it smelled of dust and neglect, the air stale enough to carry memory like perfume. Luis was 36 that summer of 2018, and for the first time since adolescence, he'd agreed to come back. He and Esteban hadn't lived here since their teens, but they'd never sold it either. Every time they considered it, the weight of what the place represented stopped them. Because this was the house their mother had disappeared from. 2 decades earlier, when Luis was 14 and Esteban 15, their parents' marriage had come apart. Their father left first, walked out mid-argument and never returned. A few years later, their mother remarried. He seemed kind enough at first, quieter than their father, but he carried a heaviness about him, like someone always waiting to be accused. The boys tried to adjust. The new man helped with bills. Their mother smiled again. But small things started to change. Locked doors. Arguments whispered instead of shouted. Nights when their mother would look at the boys as if memorizing them. Then one evening, she said she was running an errand. She took her handbag, stepped into the street, and vanished. Their stepfather told the boys not to worry. "She'll come back," he said. She needed air. 2 days later, he disappeared too. The police searched, found nothing, and eventually closed the case. The brothers were left alone in the house where everyone had gone missing. They grew up there out of necessity, cooking what they could, taking odd jobs, keeping the electricity alive one late bill at a time. But they never stopped wondering what had happened. Even as adults, they carried the unanswered question like a weight neither could drop. Where did she go? When the brothers reunited in 2018, it wasn't to search for her. They told themselves it was practical. Time to clean the place, maybe renovate it, maybe finally let it go. But beneath that reason was the same restless ache that had followed them since childhood. They opened the front door to find the house exactly as it had been. Paint cracked, curtains gray with age, family photos clinging to the walls as if time hadn't moved at all. For days they cleaned. They scraped mold off windowsills, boxed up old clothes, swept dust until it settled back again. They called a small crew of workers to fix wiring, replace the roof tiles, and patch the master bedroom wall, which had swollen from moisture. On the morning of June 1st, sunlight spilled through the cracked blinds, catching in the airborne dust like glitter. A radio played quietly from the kitchen. Somewhere in the back of the house, a hammer struck the same spot again and again, then the strike that changed everything. A shout, then silence. The brothers dropped what they were holding and ran. They reached the master suite. The contractor stood by a jagged hole, white powder drifting around him. Behind him, the other workers backed away, murmuring. Luis's pulse hammered. "What happened?" he demanded. The man pointed at the wall but didn't speak. He looked pale, sick even. Inside the opening was darkness. No wiring, no pipe, just a hollow space that hadn't seen air in years. Something pale gleamed within. They couldn't tell what it was yet, only that it didn't belong there. Police came within the hour. The scene turned procedural. Photos, tape measures, latex gloves. It was the investigators who finally broke through the rest of the wall. The brothers stood outside the door, unable to step closer, while the officers called out findings in clipped Spanish. Then came the words no one ever wants to hear. Es un cuerpo. It's a body. Inside the sealed cavity lay a human skeleton, knees bent, wrists bound, mouth gagged with decayed cloth. They didn't need DNA to know whose bones they were looking at. The medical examiner confirmed it days later. Their mother, trapped, sealed alive behind her own bedroom wall. Investigators believed she'd been bound, gagged, and forced behind the drywall before the section was resealed. The rest of the house had been repainted soon after, explaining why no one noticed. Scratches lined the plaster inside, hundreds of them, proof that she had tried to get out, proof that she had been alive when she was put there. Her sons had eaten, slept, and grown up a few feet away from where she had died, calling her name through walls that answered with silence. The news spread fast through Mexico City. Woman missing for 20 years, found hidden inside home's wall. Reporters camped outside the house for days. Neighbors whispered about the quiet stepfather who vanished after her, about strange noises they'd once heard years ago but hadn't wanted to mention. Police reopened the case, their prime suspect, the stepfather, but he was never found. Some records hinted he fled the city days after the disappearance. Others suggested he died under another name. Either way, justice had expired long before the truth surfaced. Forensic analysts estimated their mother survived a short while before suffocating. The boys, teenagers at the time, had likely slept through her muffled cries. Louis couldn't stop picturing the wall back then, painted white, smooth, ordinary. He remembered leaning his bike against it every morning before school. All that time, she had been right there. After forensic testing confirmed the remains as their mother's, authorities closed the case. The file stayed unsolved. The stepfather was never found, and the statute of limitations had long expired. Following the investigation, the brothers chose to sell the house. City records later showed it was transferred, renovated, and resold a few years after the discovery. Neither Luis nor Esteban gave extended interviews. They declined media requests, signed the final paperwork, and left Mexico City shortly after. One brief statement, recorded by a local reporter, summed up what they both felt. "We always said she wouldn't leave us. We just never imagined how right we were." And that was the last time they spoke publicly about the case. Today, the house looks ordinary. New paint, new tenants, no trace of what was once sealed inside its walls. But for those who know the story, the silence of that place still carries a weight that explanations can't lift. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.